Good evening. Welcome. We are a people of hope. I'm Andy Otto, and I'm on the pastoral team at Ignatius House Jesuit Retreat Center in Atlanta. You can find all our conversations on our Facebook page, YouTube channel, or on the People of Hope podcast. If there are any topics you would like us to discuss for future conversations, please let us know in the comments. So let's begin. Participating in conversation with me is Father Joe Lingan and Kay Satterfield, both staff members here on staff at Ignatius House. Our topic this evening is finding joy in discernment. The Ignatian tradition is rich with wisdom and practical tools on this topic. I'm going to lead off our conversation with some thoughts, but I've asked Kay to open us in a prayer. Kay?
Thank you, Andy. Dear God, we are here today to have a spiritual conversation about discernment that is informed by the inspired insights of St. Ignatius of Loyola. We hope to learn from the wisdom of St. Ignatius of how to prayerfully make decisions that are aligned with the deep desires of our heart, which are your desires for us too. The joy in all of it is that you desire to be intimately involved in our lives and to partner with us in our life's journey with all of its twists and turns. Help us to grow in an awareness of your voice speaking to our hearts, that we may choose in the big decisions and in the daily moments of our lives to act out of a blessed place of prayerful discernment. Amen.
Thank you. So for me, Ignatian spirituality and Ignatian discernment came into my life when I felt this calling to be a Jesuit 12 years ago. And I began seeing a Jesuit spiritual director at that time by the suggestion of someone. And through that experience, I slowly uncovered this new way to listen to the voice of God. And I remember when I was a child, I was always told to listen to God, and I didn't know what that meant or how I was supposed to do that. Was it a voice that I actually heard? Did I have to listen to my heart? And what did that mean? How did I exactly do that? Well, years later, after having been in religious life nearly 3 years, making the spiritual exercises, discerning not only to enter religious life, but to leave religious life and to get married and have children and so on. The wisdom and insights of St. Ignatius have been something that very close to me, and I've engaged with these tools in various important decisions that I've faced throughout the last over a decade. Now, one feature of the spiritual exercises is the election, and that's meant for those discerning a change in life state, like marriage or religious life. That's kind of the traditional approach we have to discernment. But discernment isn't only about decisions. When we talk about discernment versus decision-making, discernment's really first and foremost about listening to the voice of God that is already present. God is already speaking in our lives. And I love the Paula D'Arcy quote where she says, God comes to us disguised as our life. In other words, God is speaking through the various events and circumstances of our life, including our feelings and our emotions and our relationships. And sometimes I think we assume that God is trying to hide God's voice from us. But what I've discovered, and I get great joy in this realization, is that it's already there. That sometimes I'm just not listening. My days can go by, and I've continued in an inattentiveness, and so God's voice kind of blends in with the background noise. But Ignatian spirituality calls us to wake up and to open up our spiritual ears and eyes to hear the voice of God. Now, one thing I definitely value in Ignatius's spiritual exercises is his rules for the discernment of spirits. And these came out of his own life experience that clued him into how the good spirit coming from God, the evil spirit not coming from God, how they worked, how they moved in his life, right? He was attentive. He was listening to these movements. And my wife, Sarah, and I actually found that we could apply many of these rules and insights to relationships. And so we actually implemented a number of them into an Ignatian marriage prep program that we've developed. So these rules or insights are windows into the heart. And so when I was told to listen to God by listening to my heart, I finally realized what that meant only when I encountered Ignatius's wisdom on how God is influencing our heart. But it requires an awareness, and it requires an awareness to the interior. Now, one thing we talk about Ignatian circles a lot is desire, and that we can discern God's voice through our desire, the deep desires of our heart. It was desire that led me into religious life. It was a growing desire for marriage that led me to leave. And it was a desire that led me and my wife to the decision to have children. And our desires are very much connected with joy, right? Why wouldn't we find joy in these deep longings of our heart? St. Ignatius said the Creator deals directly with the creature. And so this truth has prompted me to live more attentively and more consciously to that relationship that God is always seeking to have with me. So that's discernment, that's listening. And that listening may lead to some kind of decision, but it's first and foremost listening. Now, these conversations we're having each month are about joy. But discerning an important choice can paralyze some people. And we can approach decision-making in fear rather than a joy that opens us up to the future. The Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner said that hope is being open to the future of God. Being open to the future of God. Now, I want to just tell you just a brief anecdote of when I was discerning to leave religious life. I found myself before a mosaic in the National Basilica in Washington, D.C. And it was an image of the two disciples who were on the road to Emmaus. They were sitting at table, and Jesus was breaking the bread, right? They recognized Jesus in the breaking of the bread. And in one instance, I saw that image as me sitting at table with my religious community, sharing a meal with Jesus. But then in the next moment, I saw it as me and my future wife, my future spouse, sharing a meal with Jesus. And in that moment, I realized possibly one of the most important lessons I had gotten from Ignatian spirituality is that discernment and decision-making is a collaborative process with God. That moment made me realize that the choices before me were both good things, good ways to serve God, and that God would delight whichever option I chose. But God was empowering me and respecting my free will and my freedom to make that choice. So this invitation to co-labor with God in bringing God's kingdom into fruition and sharing God's love with the world was a bit radical, I guess, for me, and it probably is for some other people. Many of us grow up with a more passive approach to understanding how we're a part of God's mission. And we speak about God's will as something that we were just sort of sitting and waiting for a voice maybe to come out of the clouds. But I always like to say that God doesn't dictate. God invites. God respects our desires our joys, our freedom, our thoughts, and so on. And so I love this image of not just following behind Jesus, but discernment as a walking alongside Jesus, talking about my day, my life, sharing both our thoughts and our joys and our hopes and desires. Jesus asking me how I feel, and us collaborating and discussing together how to live out this mission in the world. And then Jesus asks me to make the decision. And so I listen, pray, collaborate, and respond with love in response to this love that God has given me. So I see this as discernment, and it may be making a big life decision, but sometimes our response to God may be as simple as wanting to live a more loving life, to being a more joyful person tomorrow. So those are my thoughts, and I'd love to hear what Kay and Joe have to say.
Well, Andy, thank you very much, and I really appreciate that very personal sharing about the discernment. And if I may pick up on something that you said that I think is an important, very important insight that you shared. The reality is, I think we do face and we do make choices all the time. And the question is whether or not we're doing it consciously or unconsciously, and whether or not we are, for example, making those decisions and those choices in the context of being the person God created us to be. And you made the comment when you were talking about that discernment, that imagery at the road to Emmaus, the meal with Jesus, that how often we have the choices we face are between goods. And I think that can sometimes really tie us up in a way. Like I'm reminded, I'm thinking when I was a kid, we were taught as little kids, choose good, avoid evil, etc. And that rule seems pretty simple and easy to follow. But as we go into adulthood, we recognize that the choices become more plentiful, and then the choices of the goods that we can choose from. And I think that often ties us up, because we're making choices oftentimes we're making choices between good things. And another thought occurred to me as you were talking about the desires. In Ignatian spirituality, one of the important elements of desire, and Ignatius' thought on this, is that those desires that we have, that is more than just what I might want, but really deep down, fairly to say our heart's desire, is informed by God too. That's a holy place within ourselves where we experience, if you will, we get to that level, there's a communion with God at that point. And that certainly is a cause of great joy when we have that awareness that what I'm choosing is congruent with the will of God or the desire of God. And, to have that experience it is a very joyful experience, at least in my experience of it. So those are some initial thoughts I have, and thank you again for what you shared, Andy.
Andy, hi. I think again, it was a beautiful reflection on discernment, and I have some thoughts about Ignatian spirituality giving these beautiful tools to making decisions that are making decision prayerfully, whether it's a decision of vocation or career path, or whether, in a daily decision, whether to call a friend who may need a lift, just a lift because they're sad about something. So I guess I was wondering, Andy, when you were talking about listening, what does that look like for you? What is, how do you pay attention? What is finding God in all things?
Yeah, you're right. We make decisions throughout the day, right? Even small decisions of what to watch on TV or how to respond to someone. And I realize, certainly for myself, that it's harder sometimes to notice those things in the moment than in retrospect. And
Right.
so I think the examine prayer is one of the most important ways to sort of get into the habit of practicing, or I guess getting in tune with the language of discernment, and I guess the practice of awareness too, right? So at the end of the day, just taking 10 or 15 minutes to prayerfully review my day with God, and to discover that I was often unaware in the moment, but in retrospect, in hindsight, I can see a bit more clearly, and I can see where the hand of God was, or where God was perhaps inviting me to go. So if I ever talk about discernment, I say start praying the examine. That's the primary way that you can at least begin to pay attention more to the movements, not only in the exterior, in your life, but also what's going on, inside.
Yeah, it is about the movements of our heart.
Both, all three of us, I know, are spiritual directors, and I'm sure that you've heard this question several times, as have I. You were talking, Andy, earlier in your comments, you were mentioning about listening to God, and you certainly asked a very good question. Well, how do I listen to God? What does that sound like? What does it feel like, etc.? And I'm curious to know how you guys answer and respond to people, because I hear the question a lot. How do I know that?
May have lost him. We can try to.
Not that we're around hearing voices, but I mean, how do they know that what they're hearing is really of God in some way? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, that is the biggest question, right? And what is God's will, and how do I hear the voice? But I do believe that the voice of God is already speaking to us, and maybe we're not listening well enough, and we have to filter through the noise. I think the rules of the discernment of spirits are great, because it clues us into. Ignatius says that if we're moving towards God, which in general most of us probably are, and there are moments when we're not, but if we're doing our best to move toward God, Ignatius is going to say that God, or the good spirit, is going to continue to encourage us, mainly through a sense of peace and joy, this sort of lingering, underlying deep sense of peace. The evil spirit, on the other hand, is going to try to derail us and convince us that what we're doing is wrong, right? But there's going to be more of a sense of disquiet and agitation underneath. So I kind of like what Ignatius says about those deeper underlying feelings that last, right? Ignatius had those when he was convalescing in bed after his injury. When he had these thoughts of God, there was this lasting peace and joy. When he had these more worldly thoughts, after the initial pleasure and happiness of thinking about those thoughts, there was an underlying sadness. So I think that's the basic, seed of discernment that I would share with people.
Yeah, pay attention to how. I know for myself, sometimes I will. Well, that's not answering your question, but if I have a decision, I'll imagine going in one direction and how that plays out and what that feels like, and then I'll imagine going in the other direction and have a sense of what does that feel like. But regarding, is this the voice of God or not? Is it aligned with your life? If you're being called to spend a lot of time away from your family and you have young children, is that really a calling from God, or is it coming from something else? Is it really your ego? You're discerning it within the life that you live. What is your vocation? But I mean, Ignatius gives some practical, tools of when it comes to the decision, making a decision. Sometimes there is just this, yes, this is it, and I know it, and I know it in my heart, and it is aligned with what I feel God is calling me. And sometimes, like what happened with you, there's two goods. And then, then it's making practically a list of pros and cons, gathering information, maybe if it's a move, or to go look at the place and check it out and see how it feels. And then to pray about it. And I know Ignatius also suggests, what would you, which is something that even counselors have said to me in other contexts, what would you imagine telling your friend? What kind of advice would you give them? And then there's the other tool is to imagine yourself at the point of death, and what choice would you have preferred to make? But
I like the strategy of kind of trying on a decision, and that actually you talked about visiting a place. And when my wife Sarah and I were discerning, actually when we were living in Boston, we were discerning whether to move to California to take a job. My spiritual director actually recommended. He said, if you can and you have the ability to, can you go to that place just to visit, just to check it out, get a feel for the town, where you'd be living, and see how God speaks through that. And I had that chance to, and it was actually very enlightening for us, and actually helped us in our discernment.
I mean, I guess there's a feeling of this has a rightness to it, like when you're visiting that town and you're like, does this feel right? Do we feel at home there? I mean, I guess I'm trying to say, what does it feel like when you're saying God's speaking to us? What does that mean? God speaking to us and this or that.
Andy, you mentioned the rules of discernment of spirits. I admit my bias. I think Ignatius was brilliant. And one of the things that I noticed in the spiritual exercises, when he gives the rules of the discernment of spirits, that's not the starting point for Ignatius. In the exercises, he has one pray and reflect on their own life and their own experience, etc. Then he presents the rules so that a person, in essence, takes the rules and applies them to their own life experience, as opposed to setting up these rules and saying, okay, follow these rules and you'll be great. Instead, what he does is he really does encourage one to be, as you were saying earlier, to be aware, to be conscious, to be reflective, then to take these rules and apply them to what it is you've experienced. And when you do that, the rules make a lot more sense. And I would offer that some of the rules may make more sense to one's experience than some of the other rules. And I don't want to get sidetracked on the rules. But what Ignatius is really giving, I think, calling one to, is to be attentive and to be aware and to be conscious of what is congruent to what makes me peaceful. Where do I feel and sense peace? So as you were saying, Kay, a moment ago, of going somewhere, and how does this feel? How does this decision feel to me if I were to go ahead and make that decision? There are times when I'm talking with somebody, or even for myself, I will sometimes present, like if the person is trying to make a choice, I will sort of like force them to ask this question. If you had to make the decision right now, what would you decide? And that question can be very revealing too, about one's desire. That is there an unspoken desire or an unarticulated desire that question may alert one to or make one aware of. And those are, again, going back to what you were saying, Andy, about awareness and attentiveness. To be very reverent and respectful of our own movement and interior experience, and to reverence it really, and to give it the attention and the care that it really calls for. But oftentimes, I don't think, unless we do actual formally discernment, I don't think we pay enough attention to our own experience and our own feeling, and give it the weight or allow it to inform us in a way that we ought to, just to take the time to do this thing we call discernment. And it's a little bit more, as you had suggested, Andy, it's a little bit more than simply making a decision, being very intentional, if you will, in that. And then to recognize, more often than not, there usually comes a consolation afterwards and a confirmation that this choice, this one that I have discerned, is confirmed. And that's almost always the case, that a person will experience a confirmation of that choice and a consolation that I think is also a real cause for real joy.
The rules for discernment of spirits, rules, I think, can be kind of misleading because it makes it seem, in some sense, that they're set in stone, and I like to call them insights. And I tell people that they came out of Ignatius's life, right? They came out of his own prayer and his own experience with the good and the evil spirits, and he wrote them down and shared them with us. And so, you may find that the good and the evil spirits work with you in a unique way, and you could add your own additional rules to that list.
That's a great point.
That's true.
Very true.
I know for myself, recently, a few years back, when I moved back to Atlanta, I was choosing where to live in the city, and I thought I really wanted to live in the city of Atlanta because it's cool and to be close to all the stuff. But my mother was in a nursing home out in the suburbs in Kennesaw, and when I prayed with it a little more, my reason for moving back was really to be close to her. That was really my calling, and then so that gave me that decision to move closer to her so I could visit her more often, gave me more peace, a sense of peace about it. And I think, so I did decide to move in that direction. So that's kind of a hands-on. But I think for women tend to sometimes self-doubt decisions, self-doubt. So I think it's important to, if you took the time to prayerfully discern, to trust yourself, to grow in a trust of yourself, that God walked with you, and not to self-doubt. I mean, with every decision, there's a loss. So I know for myself, I'm very analytical, so I have to think about the loss and be okay with it and accept the loss. And if I've done that work, then when I've made the decision, I don't second guess so much, because I've accepted the loss, the lost opportunity if I went a route.
And when I was discerning to leave religious life, there was a fear, right? What am I losing, like you said, but also what am I gaining? And then there's also the fear that what if I made the wrong decision, And that's where, my spiritual director said, if you're waiting for 100% clarity, you're not going to get there. Because if you have 100% clarity, there's no need to trust. There's no room for trust, in needing to trust God, And I love there's a quote by the Jesuit John Veltri, and he says something like, God adapts to the vagaries of human decisions, if I made the wrong decision, I probably know. God's going to meet me where I am, and then I may have to make a new decision or course correct.
Well, even Ignatius did that, right? He thought he was so single-minded about going to the Holy Lands in his life with his company of men, but then it didn't work out, and so he changed direction. I mean, I think, there are twists and turns in life, and I think we're a work in progress, and we're learning through all of it. And we can grow through. I know I've made bad decisions, and I know what that feels like, but we can chalk it up to experience and go on, and hope to make a better one the next time.
It is interesting too, and what I think we've been suggesting as well in making decisions is the ability to have the data to make some decisions. And part of the discernment process, I think, is to collect data, and to be able to, as you were saying, Kay, a moment ago about moving to Atlanta, no doubt there were some pluses to living downtown, and there were some pluses to moving to the suburbs. And then, you weigh those. You have a series of pluses, if you will, or pros, but they may not weigh out equally, and here's where you once you have the data, you start looking at it. And as what you were saying, Andy, earlier about choosing to be good, between goods. What is it that, I think there's a quote that says, perfection is the enemy of the good. And that if we're interested in doing everything absolutely right every single time, I'm a big baseball fan. If you hit the ball 3 out of 10 times, you're batting 300. That's a great batting average. So your point about, the anxiety about making a mistake, that can often freeze us up from making any decision, let alone the right one. And as you were implying, Andy, earlier, that could be an evil spirit that is freezing one from making a decision. And the anxiety, I would offer, though, the greatest fear that we experience as human beings is the unknown, and giving up what is familiar. And if we're having to make a choice for something that's unfamiliar, there can be a lot of anxiety there. But to name that and to recognize that the anxiety is natural and normal, it need not be overwhelming, and it need not be given more weight than it actually warrants. And, to have even that, and to have the Holy Spirit, I think, help us weigh things appropriately and put things in their right context. And to have that, and even to rely on your own previous experience of making some good decisions, and for that matter, making some wrong decisions. There's that one great motto or adage about the only real mistakes are the ones from which we learn nothing.
Yeah.
And so we ought not be afraid or be paralyzed by any kind of anxiety there. And here to even ask God for the grace to give us peace and clarity, and to be confident that God is with us in this decision making. And if we can be confident of that, I think that's also a cause of great joy, and that even if we make the wrong decision, God is still going to be with us, as you were implying, Andy.
Before we conclude, Joe, I wonder if you could just share a little bit about your discernment retreat that is going to be coming up, and just share about that and when that's going to be.
Sure. Thank you, Andy. For those who are viewing this podcast, we do have a retreat going on at Ignatius House in July. I'm sorry, I can't remember the day. I think it's the third weekend in July. It's a weekend on discernment, and in which we will discuss what further flesh out, if you will, what we've discussed in this podcast. So I hope you would consider joining us, and if you're interested in knowing more about it, I invite you to look at ignatiushouse.org, our website, and hopefully, if you're interested, we'll see you then that weekend.
Yeah, and that's going to be July 17th through 19th. Well, thank you both for your conversation this evening, and if you can talk about discernment for hours on end. I mean, I think that people feel a lot of fear because there is a lot of gray area. There's a lot to figure out, and a lot of voices even to sift through. But we thank you all for joining us this evening. And as a reminder, People of Hope is now monthly. You can join us live every third Thursday of each month at 7:30 p.m. Just follow us on Facebook for updates and to access the live stream. Our next conversation will be on July 16th, so we hope you can join us then. In the meantime, visit us at ignatiushouse.org to learn about how you can join us on retreat, on site, or virtually. Be well and have a good night.